is the basis of all independence.
This leads us to the Civil War, the last slave revolt. Now, the reason why I call this the last slave revolt is because evidence shows that it was not the state or the government that freed African Americans. It was not the philanthropic white man that freed African Americans. It was not the great man concept of history, Abraham Lincoln, that freed African Americans. In fact, it was the African Americans who took the initiative to always free themselves. And as evidence has shown you throughout this series of videos, that whether it was the African Americans near the PD River finding their freedom, whether it was the African Americans in the Haitian Revolution, or the African descendants of the Haitian Revolution, or whether it was the blacks in Palmage, Jamaica, Veracruz, Mexico, Dominica, Florida, the list goes on. Blacks always have taken the initiative to find their freedom by any means necessary. Now, this didn't mean that all blacks would gain their freedom as a result of these efforts. But this is why you have to make a distinction between de facto liberation and de jure liberation. One could be legally free, right? De jure. A society could be legally free. A society can create laws that says there is to be no more slavery that exists. But after that law is made, slavery can very much so still exist. And society, before such a law is made, that makes it legal for a certain group of people to be enslaved, people can still find their own freedoms in that space, whether that law exists or not. All right. So the thing is, we have a tendency to look at history from a very top-down perspective. We have a tendency to look at history from a very positivist approach. And what do I mean by a positivist approach? It's, you know, the whole understanding that we look at authoritative rule of law in history, and we accept that as a truth, as an absolute truth, as a reality. That just because this is the law of the time, then therefore that was the reality of the time. That was the fact of the time. When in reality, there were laws in the books that tried to enforce that African Americans should be enslaved, that African Americans are to be chattel. But the people of the time did not see those laws as legitimate, and they broke those laws because they went against the laws of nature for them. And when they broke away from those laws and found their own freedom and found their own free spaces, the colonial powers of the time, or the state of the time, or the white people at the time delegitimized their existence, and they delegitimized their freedom. But that didn't mean they weren't free. Okay? So that's one of the misconceptions we have to come to. So when people say Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, we have to take into consideration what slaves did Abraham Lincoln really free them? And was the Civil War, looking at it from a African diasporic perspective, was it a new war that just developed between two whites, or was it an opportunity, and was it the last slave revolt? Now, this is why I argue that the Civil War was nothing but for African Americans, because a war can have two meanings depending upon which approach you're taking. When you look at the American Revolution, all right, in 1776, the American colonists were bickering about taxes and bickering about not being able to cross the proclamation line of 1763, and all kinds of things they were complaining about. Not being able to smuggle whatever it was they wanted to smuggle into this country at the time. Now, once they started to fight the British colonial government, and they might have been losing a few battles to the Redcoats, what happened? The French jumped in on the side of the American colonists, the Spanish jumped in on the side of the American colonists, and the Dutch jumped in on the side of the American colonists. Now, the French played a very important role in the victory of the American colonists. But the French had always traditionally been at war with the British. Just a few years before that, there was the French and Indian War, or what they call the 7 Years' War. One can argue, from a French perspective, the American Revolutionary War could be nothing more than an extension of the 7 Years' War, the second 7 Years' War, where they were going to defeat and break up the British Empire. You can look at the war as that and still be right. And whereas they lost the first 7 Years' War in 1763, and the British had all these gains as a result. Well, as a result of this second 7 Years' War, or 8 Years' War, however long that war lasted, the French were victorious against the British, and the British ended up losing half of their empire. Same thing with the Civil War. You can look at the Civil War from the same perspective. If you're an African American, you're not going to see the war as the war of northern aggression. You're not going to see the war as a war to keep the Union together. You're going to see the war as an extension of the trajectory of slave revolts and rebellions and escaping the institution in 1861 to 1865, rather than it just being a war between whites that blacks just played a minor role in. No, because this is how it goes. When the war first broke out, right, first of all, how did it break out? You had Abraham Lincoln was elected. He was elected president to the Republican Party. This is the first time the Republican Party as we know it had been elected on a national level. The Republican Party is born out of a failed Whig Party and a combination of the Free Soilers and the old Liberty Party people, some of whom consisted of abolitionists, people with an abolitionist spirit. Like the Liberty Party people had an abolitionist spirit for moral reasons. The Free Soilers they didn't like slavery, but it was more for economic reasons, because slavery was an institution that was bad for business. It was bad for poor whites, because they couldn't get jobs if slaves were being employed in certain areas. And then on the other hand, you had the Whig Party people who believed in industrialization and the centralization of the country. So these three factions all came together to form the Republican Party after people felt like the Whigs had lost their backbone as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. So now by 1855, the Republican Party is a party, and they elect Abraham Lincoln. A lot of the Southerners feared things like the Morrill Tariff Act that would have increased tariffs that hurt farmers in the South. People feared that Lincoln might tax slavery to an oblivion, to where the institution might not be able to thrive and exist. Lincoln said it himself in his inaugural address that he's not going to touch slavery where it already exists. He just didn't believe in the expansion of slavery. All right. But when Lincoln got elected, and it was sure that this Republican was going to be in office, this is when the southern states started to secede. They seceded out of fear. They didn't secede necessarily because they thought he was going to abolish slavery right then and right there. They just seceded because they felt like his policies would hurt the institution, would hurt their way of making money in the South. But Lincoln felt like himself that he cannot touch slavery because he felt like it was in his constitutional power in order to do so as president. What? So as soon as the South secedes and they start to take over certain major army stations, military stations in the South, this is where you start to see the conflict. Shots break out at Fort Sumter, 1861 in the spring, and before you know it, it's all out war. After South Carolina secedes, other states, southern states secede, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, and then before you know it, 10 states out of the Union. As soon as the war breaks out between these two white groups, Northerners and Southerners, guess what happens? African Americans, they start fleeing their masters. They'd always been fleeing their masters, as we talked about in other videos, right? Some people say estimates of 5,000 runaway slaves a year. Some people say that between the years 1830, 1860, there was about 150,000 runaway slaves. The Great Dismal Swamp had thousands of runaway slaves. The Great Dismal Swamp was an area that consisted of about 1 million acres of land where people went and they thrived and and they lived in those areas for extended periods of time. Generations and generations of people born and died in the Great Dismal Swamp. So runaways were the thing, right? Being a runaway was the thing. It was a reality of the time. And people found freedom in that way. And then they fought and defended their territories in that way as well. But now this opportunity is now created with now the whites going to war with each other, the northern states versus the southern states. Now this is the opportunity for African Americans in this country to find themselves a wide range of freedom, not just pockets of freedom in Florida or in North Carolina, Virginia, or in Louisiana, but to find themselves large waves of freedom for the masses. And this is what they did. Tens of thousands of African Americans, as soon as the war broke out, started fleeing. And there was a policy with the U.S. government since 1792 that blacks could not serve in the military. But when the Union Army started to lose certain battles, such as, then you see the Union Army start to accept, individual generals start to accept African Americans into the military. And before you know it, about 200,000 African Americans, about 10% of the Union Army consisted of African Americans. And not only that, but African Americans served as spies. The ones that didn't take up arms served as spies, guides, laborers, pioneers. They did whatever they could to assist in the process. And they pushed the narrative of the war, because in the beginning of the war, Abraham Lincoln stated, if I can save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would. If I can save the Union with freeing some and leaving others, I would also do that. And if I can save the Union with freeing all of the slaves, I would also do that. So what you can see based on this is Abraham Lincoln's #1 main objective was saving the Union. It was not freeing the slaves. But when the slaves became so instrumental in the war process, when they became so instrumental in pushing that narrative, then the state, Abraham Lincoln, had no choice and eventually issued the Emancipation Proclamation January 1st, 1863, in the middle of the war. See, in 1862, when he wrote that letter to Horace Greeley, he had no intentions on freeing the slaves. But by January 1863, he realized he had no choice. And this is when the tone of Abraham Lincoln starts to change. By the summer of 1863, he gave his famous Gettysburg Address, where he starts quoting the Declaration of Independence, saying all men are created equal. But the African Americans had fought. These colored troops had gone into the Great Dismal Swamp and forming those rebels in the Great Dismal Swamp, that they're in the middle of a war. And then those rebels, those runaways, those self-emancipators in the Great Dismal Swamp also got involved and participated in the liberation. This is an extension. This is the last slave revolt. And they shot their former masters down in those battlefields to guarantee their freedom and their liberation. They used this conflict to win. And so there's a book by David Williams called I Freed Myself. And the first couple of pages is very interesting to read. It reads, Duncan Winslow escaped from slavery in Tennessee during the Civil War and eventually joined the Union Army. April of 1864 found him along the Mississippi River with the 6th U.S. Heavy Artillery defending Fort Pillow, Tennessee, from attack by General Nathan Bedford Forrest and his Confederate cavalry. Outnumbered nearly 4-1, the defenders were quickly overwhelmed. As rebel troops overran the fort, Winslow and his comrades threw down their arms and tried to surrender. But Forrest's men took few prisoners. In what came to be known as Fort Pillow Massacre, Confederates slaughtered nearly 300 of their captives, most of them former slaves. To rebel officers, shouts of "Kill the goddamn niggers," Winslow was shot in his arm and thigh. In the confusion, he managed to escape by crawling among logs and brush, hiding there until the enemy moved on. When darkness fell, Winslow made his way down to the riverbank and boarded a Federal gunboat. After his release from military hospital in Mound City, Illinois, Winslow settled on a farm 3 miles west of town, where he raised garden vegetables and sold them house to house. One day, a candidate for a local office asked Winslow for his support in an upcoming election. As if to seal the deal, the candidate remarked, "Don't forget, we freed you people." In response, Winslow raised his arm and said, "See this? Looks to me like I freed myself." And then David Williams goes on to say, by the war's second year, the government badly needed black support. White recruits were difficult to come by. Lincoln in Congress had at first refused to enlist black volunteers, but the war was not going well for the Union armies, and there was no end in sight. They now wanted blacks to fight, and they knew that blacks would fight only for liberty. That was the price of their service, a service that Lincoln knew was indispensable to the Union's survival. Any different policy in regard to the colored man, Lincoln wrote in 1864, deprives us of his help, and this is more than we can bear. This is not a question of sentiment or taste, but one of physical force, which may be measured and estimated as horsepower and steam power are measured and estimated. Keep it, and you can save the Union. Throw it away, and the Union goes with it. Lincoln finally came to realize, although he did not always make it so clear, that the Union was as dependent on freedom as the other way around. Blacks had known that from the start. They publicly and repeatedly stressed that Lincoln's initial notion of preserving the Union without reference to slavery was self-defeating. Slavery and slave resistance had brought on the war. There could be no Union victory without slavery's defeat. And this whole thing is kind of emblematic as to not only did African Americans free themselves in a de facto way, right, without being recognized under the law, right, but they also freed themselves in a very de jure way. They forced even the hand of the state to change its laws and rules. Even though African Americans considered the laws and the rules illegitimate at this time, it wouldn't hurt for the African Americans to get the law on their side. But as you can see, the law on their side didn't really matter, because you can see the state still found ways to try to re-enslave African Americans even after the Civil War. And that's something that we'll actually talk about in another video. Alright? Remember, the revolution will not be pesticides.
Land is the basis of all independence.